The axe blade struck wood with a dull thunk that echoed across the frozen landscape, and Harrison Oakes heard it from half a mile away as his horse picked its way through the December snowdrifts. He had been riding for 3 days straight from Sacramento, chasing rumors of work at a ranch outside Reno, Nevada, and the sound of human activity drew him like a beacon through the white wilderness. When he crested the ridge and looked down into the small valley, he saw her, a lone figure bundled in layers of worn fabric, swinging an axe with determination that bordered on desperation. Even from this distance, Harrison could see that she was heavily pregnant, and something about the sight of her chopping wood in the blizzard conditions made his chest tighten with concern. He urged his horse forward, the bay gelding snorting clouds of steam into the frigid air as they descended toward the small cabin that sat at the edge of a clearing. The woman had not noticed him yet, too focused on her task, and as he drew closer, Harrison could see the strain on her face, the way her arms trembled with each swing of the axe. She wore no gloves, and her hands were red and chapped from the cold. The woodpile beside her was pitifully small, barely enough to last a few days, and the January snow showed no signs of letting up. "Madam," Harrison called out when he was within earshot, not wanting to startle her. "Madam, you should not be doing that in your condition." The woman spun around, the axe gripping defensively in her hands, and Harrison got his first clear look at her face. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had escaped from beneath her threadbare shawl. Her eyes were a striking green, wide with fear and exhaustion, and there were dark circles beneath them that spoke of sleepless nights. Her belly was swollen with advanced pregnancy, and Harrison guessed she was at least 8 months along, possibly more. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What do you want?" Harrison held up his hands in a gesture of peace, staying in his saddle so as not to appear threatening. "Name is Harrison Oakes, madam. I am just passing through on my way to the Garrett Ranch. I heard the sound of chopping and wanted to make sure everything was all right. It is dangerous for you to be out here alone, especially in this weather." The woman did not lower the axe, but some of the tension left her shoulders. Up close, Harrison could see that she was shivering, her thin coat inadequate protection against the Nevada winter. Snow had accumulated on her shoulders and in her hair, and her lips had a faint blue tinge that worried him. "I am fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I do not need any help." "With respect, madam, you look like you could use some assistance. When is the last time you ate a hot meal?" The question seemed to break something in her, and tears suddenly welled up in her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, her jaw clenching with stubborn pride. "That is none of your business, mister. I can take care of myself." Harrison dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and unthreatening. He was a tall man, just over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had seen too much hardship in his 30 years. He had worked as a cowboy, a ranch hand, and occasionally as a bounty hunter when times were lean, and he knew desperation when he saw it. "I am sure you can, madam," he said gently, "but there is no shame in accepting help when you need it. Let me chop this wood for you, at least. You should be inside where it is warm." "There is no warm," the woman said bitterly, and then seemed to regret the admission. She looked away, blinking back more tears. "The fire went out this morning. I have been trying to get enough wood to restart it." Harrison felt a surge of anger at whoever had left this woman in such a state, but he kept his voice calm and even. "How long have you been out here?" "A few hours," she admitted. "Maybe longer. I lost track of time." "Madam, you need to get inside right now before you catch your death." "Let me handle this." He reached for the axe, and after a moment of hesitation, she let him take it, Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it, and Harrison cursed under his breath. "When is the last time you had anything to eat or drink?" "Yesterday morning," she whispered. "I have been rationing what little I have left." Harrison made a decision in that moment that would change both of their lives. He took her arm gently and guided her toward the cabin, noting how she stumbled in the snow. "Come on. Let us get you inside and get that fire going. I have supplies in my saddlebags, enough to make a decent meal." The woman tried to protest, but she was too cold and exhausted to put up much of a fight. Harrison got her into the cabin, which was barely warmer than the outside air, and settled her in the only chair, a rickety wooden thing that looked ready to collapse. The cabin itself was small and poorly constructed, with gaps in the walls that let in drafts and a stone fireplace that had clearly seen better days. There was a narrow bed in one corner, a small table, and little else in the way of furnishings. "I will be right back," Harrison told her, and he hurried outside to tend to his horse and retrieve his supplies. He worked quickly, unsaddling the gelding and leading it into the small lean-to that served as a stable. The structure would provide some protection from the wind, at least, and Harrison made sure the horse had access to what little hay remained in the corner. Then he grabbed his saddlebags and headed back to the cabin. Inside, the woman had not moved from the chair. She sat with her hands folded over her swollen belly, staring at nothing, and Harrison felt another surge of anger at the situation. He set about building a fire, grateful to see that there was at least some kindling and a few small logs left. Within minutes, he had a small blaze going, and he immediately went back outside to chop more wood. The physical labor felt good after days in the saddle, and Harrison attacked the woodpile with vigor, his muscles warming with the exertion. He worked steadily for the next hour, chopping enough wood to last several days, and carried load after load into the cabin, stacking it neatly beside the fireplace. The woman watched him in silence, and Harrison could feel her eyes on him as he worked. When he had a good supply of wood inside, Harrison turned his attention to food. He had dried beef, beans, coffee, and a few other supplies in his saddlebags, and he set about making a simple but hearty stew. He filled a battered pot with snow to melt for water and set it over the fire, then added the ingredients and let it simmer while he made coffee. "What is your name, madam?" he asked as he worked, trying to fill the awkward silence. "Annie," she said after a long pause. "Annie Greene." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Greene," Harrison said, noting the thin gold band on her left hand. "Where is your husband?" The question made Annie flinch, and she looked away. "Gone," she said flatly. "He left 3 days ago." Harrison absorbed this information in silence, waiting to see if she would elaborate. When she did not, he asked carefully, "Is he coming back?" "No." The word was hard and certain, filled with a bitterness that made Harrison wince. He made it very clear that he was not coming back. He said he never wanted to be a father, that he could not handle the responsibility. "He took what money we had and left me here with nothing." The anger that Harrison had been feeling crystallized into something cold and hard. What kind of man would abandon his pregnant wife in the middle of winter, leaving her to fend for herself? He had seen a lot of low behavior in his time, but this ranked among the worst. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You did not deserve that." Annie laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Apparently I did. James made it clear that this was all my fault, that I had trapped him by getting pregnant, as if I did this alone." Harrison stirred the stew, not knowing what to say. He had never been married, had never even come close, and the dynamics of relationships were foreign territory to him. But he knew right from wrong, and leaving a pregnant woman to starve and freeze was undeniably wrong. "How far along are you?" he asked, changing the subject. 8 months," Annie said, her hands moving protectively over her belly. "The baby is due in about 4 weeks, maybe less. I can feel it moving all the time now, getting ready. Do you have anyone who can help you? Family nearby or friends?" Annie shook her head. "We moved here 6 months ago from Missouri. James said there was work at the mines, that we could make a fresh start. I do not know anyone in Reno, and my family is back east. I have not written to them because I was ashamed to admit that my marriage was failing." The stew was beginning to smell good, and Harrison could see Annie's nose twitching as the scent filled the cabin. He found 2 tin plates and served generous portions, handing one to Annie along with a spoon. She took it with trembling hands and immediately began to eat, not bothering with manners or pretense. Harrison watched as she devoured the food, and he silently refilled her plate when she finished, then poured her a cup of coffee with some of his precious sugar stirred in. "Thank you," Annie said when she had eaten her fill. There were tears on her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along. I was starting to think that I would not make it through another night." "You do not have to thank me," Harrison said. "Any decent person would do the same." "That has not been my experience," Annie said bitterly. "I went into town yesterday to try to find help, and everyone turned me away. They all knew James, and they all blamed me for him leaving. They said I must have driven him away somehow, that it was my fault he left." Harrison felt his jaw clench with anger. "They are wrong. No matter what problems you might have had in your marriage, nothing excuses a man abandoning his wife when she is carrying his child." Annie studied him with those striking green eyes, and Harrison felt something shift in the air between them. It was not attraction exactly, at least not yet, but rather a recognition, a sense that they were both survivors who understood what it meant to be alone in a harsh world. "Why are you helping me?" Annie asked. "You do not know me. For all you know, everything those people in town said might be true." Harrison considered the question as he sipped his coffee. "My mother raised me to help people when they need it. She was a good woman, always taking in strays and feeding anyone who showed up hungry at our door. She died when I was 16, and I have tried to live by the example she set. Besides," he added, "I have eyes. I can see that you are a decent person in a bad situation. That is all I need to know." Annie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "Will you stay? Just for tonight? I know it is asking a lot, but I am afraid to be alone. The baby has been moving differently today, and I am worried that something might be wrong." Harrison should have said no. He should have ridden on to the Garrett Ranch and the job that was waiting for him there. But looking at Annie, seeing the fear and exhaustion on her face, he could not bring himself to leave her alone. "I will stay," he said. "I can sleep by the fire. You take the bed." Relief flooded Annie's face, and she smiled for the first time since Harrison had met her. It transformed her features, making her look younger and more hopeful, and Harrison felt his heart do a strange little flip in his chest. He pushed the feeling away, reminding himself that this woman was married and pregnant with another man's child. Whatever he felt did not matter. They talked into the night, the conversation flowing more easily as Annie relaxed. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about how she had met James at a church social and been swept off her feet by his promises of adventure and a better life. She had been 19 when they married, full of romantic notions about what their life together would be like. The reality had been much harsher. "He changed after we got married," Annie said, staring into the fire. "Or maybe he was always like that and I just did not see it. He drank too much, gambled away his wages, and blamed me whenever things went wrong. When I told him I was pregnant, I thought it would bring us closer together. Instead, it drove him away." Harrison listened without judgment, understanding that sometimes people just needed to tell their story to someone who would hear them. He shared a little about his own life, about growing up on a small ranch in California, about losing both his parents by the time he was 18 and having to make his own way in the world. He had worked hard jobs and seen hard times, and there was a kinship in that shared experience of struggle. As the night wore on, Annie began to doze in her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Harrison gently guided her to the bed and made sure she was covered with the thin blankets. Then he settled himself on the floor by the fire, using his saddle as a pillow and his coat as a blanket. It was not comfortable, but he had slept in worse places. He woke several times during the night to add wood to the fire, and each time he checked on Annie to make sure she was still breathing, still warm. In the dim firelight, her face looked peaceful, younger, and Harrison found himself wondering what would become of her. She could not stay here alone, not with a baby coming. She needed help, needed someone to look after her, at least until she got back on her feet. The thought came to him slowly, reluctantly, but once it had formed, Harrison could not shake it. He could help her. He had saved up a decent amount of money from his last few jobs, enough to see them through the winter if they were careful. He could stay here, make sure she had food and firewood, help her when the baby came. It would mean giving up the job at the Garrett Ranch, but jobs came and went. A woman's life and the life of her unborn child was more important. Harrison watched the firelight flicker across the rough log walls and made his decision. He would stay, at least until Annie was back on her feet. It was what his mother would have done, and it was the right thing to do. The fact that he found himself drawn to Annie, despite the impossible circumstances, was something he would have to deal with. She was another man's wife, carrying another man's child, and Harrison would not disrespect that, no matter what he might feel. Morning came cold and gray, with fresh snow falling outside. Harrison woke to find Annie already up, moving around the cabin with careful steps. She had found his supplies and was attempting to make breakfast, and Harrison quickly got up to help her. "You should be resting," he said, taking the pan from her hands. "Let me do this." "I cannot just sit around and let you wait on me," Annie protested, but there was less fire in her voice than there had been the day before. "You have already done so much." "And I am going to do more," Harrison said firmly. He had made his decision, and now he needed to tell her. "Annie, I have been thinking. You cannot stay here alone, not with the baby coming. Let me help you." "I can stay here, at least until after the baby is born and you are strong enough to make other arrangements." Annie stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock. "You cannot be serious. You do not even know me. Why would you give up your life to help a stranger?" "Because it is the right thing to do," Harrison said simply. "And you are not a stranger anymore. You are someone who needs help, and I am someone who can provide it. It is as simple as that." "But what about your job? You said you were headed to a ranch. There will be other jobs." "Right now you need someone, and I am here. That is what matters." Annie's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Harrison stood awkwardly, not sure what to do, until she reached out and grabbed his arm, holding on like he was a lifeline in a stormy sea. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Harrison said. "Just get healthy and take care of that baby. That is all the payment I need." They settled into a routine over the next few days. Harrison spent his mornings chopping wood and tending to the animals, then rode into Reno to buy supplies with the money he had been saving. The townspeople gave him curious looks, no doubt wondering about his connection to Annie, but he ignored the gossip and focused on getting what they needed. He bought flour, beans, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee, and sugar, as well as some fabric so Annie could make clothes for the baby. He also bought coal oil for the lamp, matches, and a few other necessities. When he returned to the cabin, Annie had been cleaning and organizing, doing what she could to make the small space more livable. She moved slowly, her pregnancy making every task more difficult, but she was determined to contribute. Harrison did not argue with her, understanding that she needed to feel useful, but he watched her carefully to make sure she did not overdo it. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, learning more about each other with each passing day. Annie was smart and well-read, with a quick wit that often caught Harrison off guard. She had attended school through the 8th grade, which was more than most women of her generation, and she loved to read whenever she could get her hands on a book. Harrison found himself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Annie's face lit up when she talked about things that interested her. For his part, Harrison shared stories of his life on the trail, of the places he had seen, and the people he had met. He had been to San Francisco and Sacramento, down to Los Angeles and across to Arizona Territory. He had worked cattle drives and broken wild horses, had survived bar fights and encounters with outlaws. Annie listened with rapt attention, clearly fascinated by a life so different from her own sheltered upbringing. "Have you ever been in love?" Annie asked one evening, about a week after Harrison had first arrived. They were sitting by the fire, and the question came out of nowhere, catching Harrison off guard. He considered the question carefully before answering. "I thought I was, once. There was a girl back in California, the daughter of the ranch owner I worked for. We were both young, maybe 19 or 20. I thought she felt the same way about me, but when I asked her father for permission to court her, he laughed in my face, said his daughter was not going to throw her life away on a cowboy with no prospects. The girl married a banker from San Francisco 6 months later. That must have hurt," Annie said softly. "It did at the time, but looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of her than the reality. I did not really know her, not the way you need to know someone to spend your life with them. After that, I focused on work and did not think much about romance." "Do you ever get lonely?" Harrison looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, and answered honestly. "Yes. Sometimes the loneliness is the hardest part, but I learned to live with it." "I know what you mean," Annie said quietly. "I was lonely even when James was here. Is that possible, to be lonely when you are with someone?" "I think it might be the worst kind of lonely," Harrison said. "At least when you are alone, you know why you feel that way. When you are with someone and still feel lonely, it makes you question everything." Annie nodded, her hand moving absently over her belly. "The baby is moving," she said, changing the subject. "Do you want to feel?" Harrison hesitated, not sure if it was appropriate, but Annie reached out and took his hand, placing it on her stomach. For a moment he felt nothing, and then there was a distinct flutter, like a butterfly trapped under fabric. His eyes widened with wonder. "That is amazing," he breathed. "I have never felt anything like that." "The baby has been very active lately," Annie said with a smile. "I think it is getting ready to make an appearance." The thought of Annie going into labor was both exciting and terrifying to Harrison. He knew nothing about childbirth, and the nearest doctor was in Reno, several miles away. If something went wrong, if there were complications, he would not know what to do. "We should talk about what happens when the baby comes," Harrison said, removing his hand reluctantly. "I do not know anything about delivering babies. Should we find a midwife or a doctor?" "There is a midwife in Reno, Mrs. Patterson. I met her when I first came to town. She said I could send for her when my time came, but I do not know if she will come now after James left. She might not want to be associated with me." "Then we will find someone else," Harrison said firmly. or I will deliver the baby myself if I have to. Either way, you and the baby are going to be fine." Annie looked at him with such trust and gratitude that Harrison felt his chest tighten. He was starting to care for this woman, more than was wise given the circumstances. But he could not help himself. There was something about Annie that drew him in, something beyond her pretty face and quick mind. She had a core of strength that impressed him, a determination to survive and protect her child no matter what it cost her. As January turned to February, the weather grew even colder. Blizzards swept through the Nevada mountains, dumping feet of snow and making it nearly impossible to travel. Harrison made one last trip to Reno before the worst of the storms hit, stocking up on supplies and leaving word with Mrs. Patterson about Annie's situation. The midwife had been sympathetic and promised to come as soon as she could when Annie's time came, weather permitting. During the long days and nights snowed in together, Harrison and Annie grew closer. They played cards by the fire, read aloud from the 2 books Annie owned, and talked about everything and nothing. Harrison found himself noticing small things about Annie, the way she hummed while she worked, the way she laughed at his bad jokes, the way she unconsciously touched her belly whenever she was worried or thinking deeply. He was falling in love with her. The realization came slowly, then all at once, and Harrison did not know what to do about it. Annie was still married, at least legally, even if her husband had abandoned her. She was vulnerable and dependent on him for survival. It would be wrong to say anything, to burden her with his feelings when she had so much else to worry about. But the feelings were there, growing stronger every day, and Harrison found himself imagining a future that could never be. He imagined Annie as his wife, raising the baby together, building a real home and a real life. He imagined more children, a whole brood of them, filling a house with laughter and love. He imagined growing old with Annie, sitting on a porch somewhere and watching their grandchildren play. It was a beautiful dream, and it hurt to know it could never be real. Annie went into labor on a cold February night, 3 weeks after Harrison had first found her chopping wood in the snow. She woke him in the early hours of the morning, her voice tight with pain. "Harrison, it is time. The baby is coming." Harrison was on his feet in seconds, his heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Annie said through gritted teeth. "The pain started a few hours ago, but they are getting closer together now." Harrison helped her to the bed and then ran outside to saddle his horse, planning to ride to Reno for the midwife. But when he opened the cabin door, his heart sank. Another blizzard had blown in during the night, and visibility was near zero. There was no way he could make it to town and back, not in this weather. He would get lost and freeze to death, and Annie would be left alone. He went back inside, his mind racing. "I cannot get to town," he told Annie. "The storm is too bad. I am going to have to deliver the baby myself." Fear flashed across Annie's face, but she nodded. "Okay, I trust you." Those 3 words gave Harrison strength. He had no idea what he was doing, but he would figure it out. Women had been having babies since the beginning of time, often without any help at all. He could do this. He had to. The next several hours were the most terrifying of Harrison's life. Annie's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Harrison was certain that something was going horribly wrong. But Annie was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined, and she fought through the pain with a determination that awed him. "You are doing great," Harrison told her over and over, holding her hand and wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Just keep breathing. You can do this." "I cannot," Annie sobbed at one point, exhausted and in agony. "It hurts too much. I cannot do this." "Yes, you can," Harrison said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "You are the strongest person I know, Annie Greene. You survived being abandoned in the middle of winter." You survived with no food or heat. You can survive this too. And I am right here with you. I am not going anywhere." The baby finally arrived just after dawn, a tiny, squalling thing with a shock of dark hair. Harrison had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying. His hands shook as he wrapped the infant in clean cloth, and tears streamed down his face as he placed the baby in Annie's arms. "It is a boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You have a son." Annie looked down at her baby with wonder and love, and Harrison saw something shift in her expression. This tiny, helpless creature was hers, and she would do anything to protect him. That fierce maternal love was something Harrison recognized because he was starting to feel something similar. He had helped bring this child into the world, had kept Annie alive so she could give birth, and that created a bond he had not expected. "He is perfect," Annie whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers. "Thank you, Harrison. Thank you for everything." "You did all the hard work," Harrison said, trying to smile through his tears. "I just caught him." Over the next few days, Harrison learned how to care for a newborn. He changed diapers made from torn cloth, helped Annie figure out how to nurse, and walked the floor with the baby when he cried in the night. Annie had named him Thomas, after her father, and Thomas Greene was a loud, demanding little person who kept them both exhausted. But Harrison did not mind. He found himself falling in love with the baby, almost as much as he had fallen in love with Annie. He loved watching Thomas sleep, loved the way the baby's tiny hand would curl around his finger, loved the milky smell of him after he nursed. It was easy to forget that Thomas was not his son, easy to pretend that they were a real family. Annie recovered slowly from the birth, and Harrison insisted that she rest as much as possible while he handled the chores and took care of Thomas when she needed to sleep. He was running on very little sleep himself, but he did not care. This mattered more than rest, more than anything else in his life had ever mattered. One evening, about 2 weeks after Thomas was born, Annie called Harrison over to where she sat by the fire, nursing the baby. "I need to talk to you," she said, and there was something serious in her tone that made Harrison's stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it?" he asked, sitting down across from her. Annie took a deep breath, clearly gathering her courage. "I have been thinking about our situation, about what happens next. You have been so good to us, Harrison. You saved my life and Thomas's life, and I will never be able to repay that debt. But I cannot keep depending on you forever. You have your own life to live, your own dreams to chase. I need to figure out how to take care of Thomas and myself on our own." Harrison felt panic rise in his chest. The thought of leaving Annie and Thomas, of going back to his solitary life on the trail, was physically painful. But what choice did he have? Annie had made it clear that this was a temporary arrangement, that she did not expect or want him to stay forever. "What will you do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have been thinking about that. I could write to my parents, ask them to send money for train fare back to Missouri. They would take me in, even though I know they would be disappointed in how my marriage turned out. Or I could try to find work here in Reno, maybe as a seamstress or a laundress. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she sometimes needs help with difficult births. I could learn from her, become a midwife's assistant." "Those are both good options," Harrison said carefully, even though the thought of Annie leaving Nevada made his heart ache. "But you do not have to decide right away. It is still winter, and traveling with a newborn would be dangerous. Wait until spring at least." "That is months away," Annie said. "I cannot ask you to stay here that long. You need to find work, make money. You have already done so much for us." Harrison looked at her, at this woman he had come to love more than he thought possible, and made a decision. He was tired of hiding his feelings, tired of pretending that he was just a good Samaritan helping a stranger. If Annie rejected him, so be it. At least he would know where he stood. "What if I do not want to leave?" he said quietly. "What if I want to stay here with you and Thomas?" Annie's eyes widened with shock. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you, Annie. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you chopping wood in the snow, so stubborn and determined to survive. I know the timing is terrible, and I know you probably do not feel the same way, but I cannot keep pretending that I am just here out of charity. I care about you and Thomas, and I want to be part of your lives." For a long moment, Annie just stared at him, and Harrison braced himself for rejection. But then tears started to roll down her cheeks, and she smiled, the biggest, brightest smile he had ever seen. "I have feelings for you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. I felt like I was betraying my marriage vows, even though James betrayed them first when he abandoned us. But I cannot help how I feel. You have been everything he never was. You are kind and gentle and strong, and Thomas already loves you. I see it in the way he calms down when you hold him." Harrison felt like his heart might burst. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated because I helped you." "I am sure," Annie said firmly. "I know it is fast and I know people will talk, but I do not care. I want to be with you, Harrison. I want us to be a real family if you want that too." "I want that more than anything," Harrison said. He moved to sit beside her on the bed, careful not to disturb Thomas, and took her free hand in his. "But there are practicalities we need to discuss. You are still legally married to James." Annie's face darkened. "I know, but he abandoned me. Surely that means something legally. I could get a divorce." "Divorce is expensive and takes time," Harrison said. "And it carries a stigma, especially for women. People would talk." "Let them talk," Annie said fiercely. "I do not care what people think anymore. James left me to die, Harrison. He does not get to control my life anymore." Harrison admired her courage, but he knew the reality of their situation was more complicated than Annie wanted to believe. Divorce was difficult to obtain in Nevada in 1886, and it would require them to go through the legal system, which meant lawyers and fees they could not afford. And even if Annie did manage to get a divorce, there would always be people who judged her for it. But none of that mattered as much as being together. They would figure out the details somehow. "Then we will find a way," Harrison said. "I promise you, Annie, I will make this work. I will give you and Thomas the life you deserve." They talked long into the night, making plans and dreaming of the future. Harrison had saved up nearly $300, enough to buy a small piece of land if they were careful. They could build a real house, raise animals, maybe start a small ranch. It would be hard work, but they were both used to that. And they would have each other, which was all that really mattered. When Thomas woke, fussing and hungry, Harrison held him while Annie prepared to nurse, and he marveled at how natural it all felt. This was what he had been searching for all his life without knowing it, this sense of belonging, of being needed and wanted. He had found his family, unconventional as it might be, and he would fight to keep them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and growing happiness. Harrison began the process of looking for land, riding into Reno to speak with the land office. He found a promising parcel about 5 miles outside of town, 100 acres with a good water source and enough flat land for farming and grazing. The price was reasonable, $250, and Harrison had enough saved to make the purchase with a little left over for supplies. While he was in town, he also spoke to a lawyer about Annie's situation. The news was not good. Divorce in Nevada required proof of adultery, extreme cruelty, or desertion. And even with James's abandonment, the process would take at least a year and cost money they could not spare. The lawyer suggested an alternative: Since James had left Nevada and had no intention of returning, Annie could simply live as though she were unmarried. It was not ideal, and it was not legal, but it was practical. Harrison and Annie discussed the option and decided to take it. They would live as husband and wife, even if they could not legally marry yet. It was not the traditional path, but nothing about their relationship had been traditional so far. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, Harrison bought the land and began making plans for their home. He hired a few men from Reno to help with the construction, and they worked from dawn to dusk, building a sturdy cabin with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through future winters. Annie spent her days caring for Thomas and planning how to furnish their new home. She was sewing curtains from the fabric Harrison had bought, making them cheerful and bright to combat the drabness of frontier life. She sang while she worked, and Harrison loved listening to her voice drift across their temporary home. They moved into the new cabin in April, and it felt like a new beginning. The cabin smelled of fresh cut pine, and everything was clean and new. Harrison had built Annie a proper bed, sturdy and comfortable, and there was a cradle for Thomas that rocked gently when the baby fussed. There was even a rocking chair by the fireplace where Annie could sit and nurse. "It is perfect," Annie said, looking around their new home with tears of joy in her eyes. "I cannot believe this is really ours." "It is really ours," Harrison confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "You, me, and Thomas. This is our home." That night, after they had put Thomas to bed in his cradle, Harrison and Annie finally consummated their relationship. It was tender and sweet, both of them nervous and eager at the same time. Harrison was gentle, mindful of the fact that Annie had given birth just 2 months before, and Annie responded to him with a passion that surprised them both. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their new bed, and Harrison felt a contentment he had never experienced before. This was where he belonged, with Annie in his arms and their son sleeping peacefully nearby. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too," Annie replied, snuggling closer. "Thank you for finding me, Harrison. Thank you for saving us." "You saved me too," Harrison said. "I did not realize how empty my life was until I met you." As spring turned to summer, they settled into their new life. Harrison worked hard to establish their ranch, buying a few head of cattle and some chickens to start. He built a proper barn and a chicken coop, and he plowed a field for planting. Annie kept the house, cared for Thomas, and started a vegetable garden. It was exhausting work, but they were building something together, and that made all the difference. Thomas grew rapidly, becoming a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and babbled constantly. He adored Harrison, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and crying when he left. Harrison loved the boy as if he were his own flesh and blood, never thinking of him as anything other than his son. In June, they had visitors. A couple from a neighboring ranch stopped by to introduce themselves, and Harrison and Annie welcomed them nervously, unsure how they would be received. But the neighbors, John and Sarah Mitchell, were friendly and non-judgmental. They had heard the story of how Harrison had found Annie and helped her, and they respected the courage it had taken for both of them to build a new life together. "We do not hold with gossiping," Sarah said firmly when Annie tried to explain their situation. "You two are good people trying to make an honest living, and that is all that matters to us. If you ever need anything, you just let us know." The friendship with the Mitchells was the first of many. As word spread about the hard-working couple on the new ranch, more neighbors came to visit, and most of them were accepting and kind. There were some who disapproved, of course, who whispered about Annie's abandoned marriage and the impropriety of her living with Harrison. But those voices grew quieter as people saw how devoted Harrison and Annie were to each other and to Thomas. In August, Harrison received unexpected news. A man from Reno came out to the ranch with a letter that had been forwarded from Missouri. It was from a lawyer representing James Greene, and Harrison's stomach dropped as he read it. James was suing for divorce, claiming that Annie had committed adultery by living with Harrison. He wanted nothing to do with Thomas and was willing to relinquish all parental rights in exchange for Annie agreeing not to seek any financial support. Harrison showed the letter to Annie, and they both sat in stunned silence as they processed the implications. On one hand, it was the answer to their prayers. If James filed for divorce and won, Annie would be free to marry Harrison legally. On the other hand, the accusations were insulting and hurtful, painting Annie as the guilty party when James was the one who had abandoned his family. "Let him do it," Annie said finally, her voice hard. "Let him claim whatever he wants. We know the truth, and that is all that matters. If this is what it takes for us to be free of him, then so be it." Harrison agreed, and they wrote back to the lawyer, agreeing to James's terms. The divorce would take several months to finalize, but the process had begun. For the first time since they had met, Harrison and Annie could see a real future together, one where they were legally married and Thomas had Harrison's name. The divorce was granted in November, just as winter was setting in again. The judge had been sympathetic to Annie's situation, and James's abandonment had worked in their favor. The decree stated that Annie had been the innocent party, and that James had forfeited all rights and responsibilities to Thomas. Annie was free. Harrison proposed to her that same night, going down on one knee by the fireplace while Thomas watched from his spot on the floor, playing with wooden blocks Harrison had carved for him. "Annie Greene, you are the love of my life, and the reason I get up every morning. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, legally and in the eyes of God?" "Yes," Annie said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in December, exactly 1 year after Harrison had first found Annie chopping wood in the snow. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in Reno with their neighbors as witnesses. Annie wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, and Harrison wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Thomas, now 10 months old and learning to walk, babbled happily throughout the ceremony, making everyone laugh when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Harrison kissed Annie with all the love and passion he felt, and the small congregation erupted in applause. They were officially a family now, bound by law and by love. The winter of 1887 was cold but joyful. Harrison and Annie spent their evenings by the fire, talking and dreaming about the future. They wanted more children, a whole house full of them if they were blessed. They wanted to expand the ranch, make it prosperous enough to provide for their growing family. They wanted to grow old together, side by side, facing whatever challenges life threw at them. Annie became pregnant again in February, and they were both thrilled. Harrison was attentive and protective, remembering the difficulties of Thomas's birth, and determined that this time would be easier. He made sure Annie rested, that she ate well and did not overwork herself. He took on even more of the chores, enlisting help from their neighbors when necessary. Their daughter was born in October of 1887, a healthy, squalling baby with red hair like her mother and gray eyes like Harrison. They named her Clara May, and she was the joy of their lives. Thomas, now almost 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Harrison and Annie laughed as they navigated the challenges of having 2 small children, exhausted but happy. As the years passed, their ranch grew and prospered. Harrison proved to be a skilled rancher, and their herd of cattle increased steadily. They added horses and sheep, and Annie's vegetable garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes. They hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, young men who were grateful for honest employment and a fair boss. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed Harrison everywhere, learning everything he could about ranching and livestock. He called Harrison Pa from the time he could talk, and Harrison never corrected him. As far as Harrison was concerned, Thomas was his son in every way that mattered. Clara was a daddy's girl from the start, wrapping Harrison around her little finger with her smiles and laughter. She had her mother's quick mind and her father's gentle nature, and she was adored by everyone who met her. In 1890, Annie gave birth to another son, whom they named Henry James after Harrison's father. And in 1893, their family was completed with the birth of another daughter, Elizabeth Ann. Their home was always full of noise and laughter, of children playing and dogs barking, and the general chaos of a large, loving family. Annie bloomed in her role as wife and mother. The scared, desperate woman Harrison had found chopping wood in the snow was gone, replaced by a confident, capable woman who ran their household with efficiency and love. She was involved in the community, helping other women when they needed it and hosting gatherings at their ranch. She never forgot how alone she had felt, how terrifying it had been to face the world without support, and she made sure no other woman in their community had to face that same desperation. Harrison watched his family grow with profound gratitude. He had found his purpose in life, his reason for being, and it was this: to love and protect Annie and their children, to build a legacy that would outlast him. He worked hard every day, not because he had to, but because he wanted to give his family the best life possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December of 1897, Harrison and Annie sat by the fire after putting the children to bed, reflecting on how far they had come. Thomas was 11 now, already showing signs of the man he would become. Clara was 10, Henry was 7, and Elizabeth was 4, and each child was healthy and happy. "You ever think about that day?" Annie asked, leaning against Harrison's shoulder. "The day you found me in the snow all the time," Harrison admitted. "I think about how close I came to riding past, how I almost did not investigate the sound of the axe. What would have happened to you if I had just kept going?" "I try not to think about that," Annie said with a shudder. "I probably would have frozen to death that night or died in childbirth." "You saved my life, Harrison. You saved Thomas's life. And you gave my life meaning," Harrison said, kissing the top of her head. "I was just drifting before I met you, going from job to job with no real purpose. You and the children, this ranch, this life we have built together, it is everything I never knew I needed." "We have been blessed," Annie agreed. "So incredibly blessed." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire crackle and listening to the winter wind howl outside, Harrison felt a deep sense of peace. His life had not turned out the way he had expected, but it had turned out better than he ever could have imagined. He had found love in the most unlikely place, at the most unlikely time, and it had transformed him completely. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas left home at 18 to work on a large ranch in California, eager to make his own way in the world but always coming home for holidays and important occasions. Clara married a kind young man from Reno and settled nearby, giving Harrison and Annie their first grandchildren. Henry showed an aptitude for working with horses and started a successful business breeding and training them. And Elizabeth, their youngest, surprised everyone by going to teachers' college and becoming a school teacher. Harrison and Annie aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had weathered financial hardships, illness, loss, and all the normal trials of life, but they had faced everything together, side by side. Their ranch had become a landmark in the community, known for its quality livestock and for the kindness of its owners. In 1915, on a warm spring evening, Harrison and Annie sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of orange and pink. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray and their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But their love was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger, tempered by time and experience. "I have had a good life," Harrison said, taking Annie's hand in his. "A very good life." "We have had a good life," Annie corrected with a smile. "Together." "Together," Harrison agreed. "That is what made it good. I love you, Annie. I loved you from the moment I saw you chopping wood in the snow, stubborn and brave and refusing to give up. And I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Annie said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You are the best man I have ever known, Harrison Oakes. You saved me, and then you gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. I could not have asked for a better husband or a better father for my children." They sat together as the sun set, their hands clasped and their hearts full. Two people who had found each other in the most desperate of circumstances and built something beautiful together. Their story had started with tragedy and desperation, with a woman abandoned and a cowboy passing by, but it had become a love story for the ages. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Harrison pulled Annie close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, just as she had done thousands of times before. They had started as strangers, became friends, fell in love, and built a life that had lasted decades. They had 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and a legacy of love and hard work that would continue long after they were gone. "Thank you for stopping that day," Annie whispered. "Thank you for hearing the sound of the axe and choosing to investigate. Thank you for every choice you made that brought us here." "Thank you for being brave enough to survive," Harrison replied. "Thank you for letting me into your life and your heart. Thank you for giving me a reason to be a better man." They sat together until the night grew cold and the stars filled the sky. 2 souls so perfectly matched that it seemed impossible they had ever been apart. Their love had been tested by hardship and circumstance, by society's judgment and their own doubts, but it had endured and thrived. They had built a family, a home, and a life together, and that was the greatest achievement of all. As they finally rose to go inside, Harrison took one last look at the land he had worked for decades, the land where he had built his dreams and raised his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight he had everything he needed. He had Annie, he had his children and grandchildren, and he had a lifetime of memories to treasure. Hand in hand, they walked inside their home, ready to face whatever the future held, together as they had always been and always would be. The cowboy who had once drifted from place to place had found his home, and the woman who had been abandoned in her darkest hour had found her happiness. Their story was one of resilience, redemption, and the transformative power of love, a testament to the truth that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting warm shadows across the walls of the home that love had built. And outside, the Nevada night was peaceful and still, the snow of that long-ago December storm nothing but a distant memory in a life filled with warmth and joy.